All right, all right. Welcome to this live event for dynamics of neuroplasticity. Today I'll be talking about again, goal setting and using it to relate neuroplasticity to what we're seeing with goal setting. Now, last week I did talk a little bit about how goal setting is provides the context for things like affirmations, mental rehearsal, etc. Then today I just want to make some distinctions with respect to three different kinds of goals is what I'll talk about. Just getting there we go. Now, if I look at the three kinds of goals, last week I made a statement that we really don't need people who are going after small goals don't really need a coach. I didn't mean to say that coaches are not going to help them. What I'm suggesting is that if a person is going to come to me with a small goal, I will expand that goal. I'm going to try to 3x it. And if we can't 3x it together, I'm probably not going to take that work on, because I can point them to a book, I can point them to a video, etc. But when it gets into stretch and transformational goals, then it's important to have some help. You can do it on your own, but it's going to take a lot longer. I guess another way of saying it is that having help with a small incremental goal, the delta in terms of the outcome is not going to be as great as it will be or can be if you're talking about a stretch goal or a transformational goal. So let's just call it incremental. We've got an incremental goal here, and we have a transformation goal. So what we know is that with incremental goals, it's something that we've seen before. It's known. We have context, there's examples. But when you get into transformation goals, there's a lot of unknown. Few examples. I talk about designing in the field of infinite possibilities. Unfamiliar. Too many options, right? So the reason I'm looking at it this way is because with incremental goals, the primary driver that the person has to, or the shift that the person has to make, is behavioral. Whereas over here, there's two shifts that they have to make. One is identity, and the other is reactivity. And I would argue that we could also put stretch goals over here, because a stretch goal is going to do some of that same, have some of those same characteristics, where it's going to need a shift in identity and a shift in reactivity. So this gets to why I was saying that people, generally speaking, successful people generally have a handle on behavioral goals. They may not, or behavioral habits. These are habits down here. Now, they may not always be able to just adopt a new habit, but generally speaking, if it's important enough to them, they know what to do to make a shift in a behavioral habit. Identity habits are harder because those are constructs. Those are a compilation of many, many elements that go up that are underneath it. So people try to change identity habits at the construct level, which is going to be very, very difficult. Hold on a second. And then reactivity habits are even harder to change because one, we're not in control. Uh, we're reacting to many things from the past, and each time you react, we sort of reinforce those neural pathways. What I'm going to do is talk about why and how this gets involved and causes us to have challenges in reaching the goal. So this is the backdrop right here. If you say you've got habits, all this is habits, and behavioral habits, we can change them. People have a handle on them. They know what to do. But when it comes to reactivity and identity habits, those are sort of out of reach. So then people come up with the assumption that they have imposter syndrome. You get imposter syndrome, you get fixed mindset. Now, this area right here is where the reactivity comes in. Now, you can have your habits set up over here and do the things that you need to do. But when we get into this coherence, and as I've mentioned before, when coherence is low, we're going to have more chaos and more rigidity. This is what happens with reaction. So what we're talking about is building neural pathways, new neural pathways, so that when we do get knocked off course, we're able to get back on course very quickly. And it's a matter of working in this first half second. Let's see here. It's a matter of working in the first half second. Where it is. And this is the 600 millisecond. I call it 600 milliseconds because there's a tenth of a second that's pre-stimulus, and then there's the stimulus, and then we have the reaction formation, and then we have the response over here where you have the conscious mind. I want to pull up another slide. It's not there. Let's pull up this one. So this is the other slide. We've got the side A, side B, network of neurons is over here. Then we have the conscious mind over here. This is where everything is happening. This is why reactivity habits and identity habits are so difficult. If a person changes, in order to change your identity habits, you've got to change it at the elements level, the smaller pieces that are over here on this side. And here's that first 600 milliseconds. This is that pre-listening, and this initial detection, early detection area, this is where we can do things like have a perpetual question. So just by changing the perpetual question, you're going to change your priming. This is what I mentioned the other day about preemptive priming. You're going to change your priming with a new perpetual question. That's going to impact your initial detection. So this is early on. This is where cognitive biases come in. This is where the reticular activating system is understanding what does this stimulus mean. So remember, we're processing the potential of 11 million bits per second. So right here, you got a couple of million bits per second potentially processed, depending on the level of the stimulus, if it's a threat or what have you. And over here is where your reticular activating system is looking at what's important, what's happened before, what is this likely, what does this mean? Cognitive biases are kicking in here. So by changing your perpetual question, you're priming yourself differently so that that stimulus is going to be less likely perceived as a threat. But there's another thing we do, and that is I talk about conditioning the trajectory bias. So in this area, in this first 200 to 300 milliseconds, and it changes. If a neuroscientist were to talk about this, they would say, well, that's not the way it always is. And that's true. I'm using a 1 second model to just make sense of it. But like, for example, if a person was in a phobia response, this thing could collapse where they're having multiple of these cycles happening inside of 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 of these cycles, because it's like a phobia response, somebody crashing out. If you've ever seen them, it's just they're reacting to reacting. But that said, and it's also more looping, it's more feedback loops like this. It's a lot more of this going on. But as soon as you get into the neuroscience speak, it gets confusing and you start having these caveats and it makes it more difficult. I want to keep it accessible and actionable. So we do have a positivity exercise which shifts the unconscious default that something is a threat. We shift it to neutral. So rather than having 80 to 90% of our stimuli becoming a threat or being perceived as a threat, which is going to generate the fight or flight, which leads to the cortisol, which leads to the reactivity, we're changing that perspective so that it's more likely perceived as neutral and even positive. And that's about 6 weeks. It takes a couple of minutes a day because you're just training your system. And when I talk about training the network of neurons, you train it the same way you would train an animal. You have to do the repetition. You have to, you're not going to use treats and all that, but you do have to use implementation intentions, and you process it. So the way we practice it is by going into past things, because it's about speed. It's about, remember, the network of neurons side is very fast. So you're training it to switch. And that takes about 6 weeks. Then the next one you have is the other part of this conditioned trajectory bias is if this was preemptive priming, and the positivity exercise, this is preemptive priming, and then the positivity exercise is the first step of modulation. This is dynamic modulation in here, where you're intercepting that stimulus, so it's not seen as a big threat. I have a slide. I'll show you that slide. In fact, let's go right there now. So there's your pre-stimulus priming. Here's your preemptive interception, and then the in-flight modulation. And then you have dynamic regulation. So these are the areas where we can apply neuroplasticity. Structural boundaries, you know how to set boundaries. But once you get into this zone of the stimulus reaction response, this is where the habits are kicking in. And to do anything with this, you're doing it early on. So the preemptive stimulus priming, that would be like your perpetual question. Then the preemptive interception, that's the positivity exercise I was referring to. And then we have in-flight modulation. This is where we can insert a deep breath. We can insert a pattern interrupt. One of the things, and if you think about it like this, just to give an example, and there's, by the way, I have many examples of things that you can use, tools that you can use to change or shift a habit that's in flight. And it's different for everybody. Everything's not going to work for everyone. This is why I have to be working face to face with somebody when I'm doing this, because I'm using the sensory acuity to read the signals. I'm reading what shifts are happening, and this is how we figure out what's likely to work, what's not likely to work. It's literally an iterative process. So the preemptive interception is training that we do. The in-flight modulation is a quick automatic. So rather than with like the way we thought about it in the past with regulation, which is over here, you take a deep breath. But that's taking a deep breath after you've had meaning. Over here, meaning is forming and all this. And by the time meaning forms, now you're defending it. So the preemptive interception will slow that down a lot. In-flight modulation is programming, conditioning in the breath. And another thing I'll do is this is not that. So it's just a few words. This is not that. What I mean by that, let's say you open an email and that email creates this feeling, something just rises up. It's a sensation that you feel. You don't know what it means yet. It's just an initial thing. But if you don't do anything about it, it keeps rising. And then you start thinking about all the bad things that are potentially happening. And that's where you can start reacting to the reactions. And one of the things you can easily condition in is just turn your head and look at something else. Because remember, this is happening in tenths of a second. So by turning your head and looking at something else, it's an interrupt. The second thing you can do is, as I said, taking a deep breath through your nose. But this is not that. That sensation that's coming up is from the past. It's something that is similar to this. It was in the past, and this is why you're getting that sensation. So by saying something simple as this is not that, you're interrupting that sensation that's coming up. So the challenge is this side communicates in words. This side is all signal, and we don't have words to define this. And we tend to wait until it comes over here so we have meaning for it. But you already know if this thing is rising up, it's perceiving a threat. And you know that if it's perceiving a threat, it's from associations, it's from the past. And that's where you can intervene with a pre-planned stimulus reaction. That's what I call it, in-flight modulation. And then we have dynamic regulation, which is the last line of defense, so to speak, because over here we can still do reframing. Now it's coming into the conscious mind. The meaning has come across with some words. Ideally, we've already solved that, so we're fine over here. But if it gets through, now we have dynamic regulation. You might do some emotional modulation there. You're going to do some reframing, continue with the breath. All this is inside of a half second, maybe 3/4 of a second. And over here, step 4 would be the response. So that's step 3. This picture that I'm looking at here is just this. It's step 3. What we've already done is we've worked on beliefs, habits, priming, mindset, physiology. We're doing laps around this because as you strengthen it, there's always going to be a new weak link. You solve the new weak link and you just keep running laps. This is a constant thing because this is happening. We're going through this potentially tens of thousands of times a day. And we want to have coherence, high coherence. And a lot of that reactivity and the identity I was talking about with goal setting is about getting this. We've got to get to a place where we are in coherence, a high state of coherence, no matter what. I don't care how much chaos is going on around you. We want to have high coherence. And then step 3 is what I was just referring to. We have the readiness, the orientation, the mobilization. And we can train in those steps. So when I talk about neuroplasticity, it's how we can achieve more. It gets back to the identity goals. What I was referring to on the pad here, incremental goals are easier because the habits you're dealing with are just behavioral. Stretch goals, and especially transformation goals, are much more difficult because we're talking about identity and reactivity, and we don't know where that reactivity is coming from. And here's an interesting thing. When I'm working with somebody, I don't have to know what they're reacting to. I don't have to know what the associations are. I can walk them through it. It doesn't matter. See, that's a big difference with using neuroplasticity. It doesn't, the content doesn't matter. It's that there's an association and we have to rewrite that association. Why can we rewrite it? Because we know it's not a tiger. We know that the cortisol level of threat is because it's treating it as a tiger. We know it's not a tiger. So we already know that we can talk about the associations in a way that it doesn't mean anything. So the next part of this is we'll go to this view. Now, I call this is the above the line. We talk about above the line. So we have the upper limit, the lower limit. People are moving along and they're in the comfort zone. They set a goal, and that goal takes them up into this area here. When you have a stretch goal or a transformation goal, you have this barrier. Joe Dispenza talks about it like he calls it crossing the river, and he's using different uh, vernacular, etc. But when it comes to transformation or like major goals, you have to change your identity. You have to change who you are, and that identity is changed at the elements level. And each time you make a shift, it's like I'm peeling an onion. Something else may come up. You know, getting cheated, things your teacher said to you 50 years ago, 40 years ago, getting bullied 30, 40 years ago. It doesn't matter that it happened so long ago. The association is there. I call it little t. It could be something as simple as somebody knocked your ice cream cone out of your hand and they laughed at you. And now this is this threat response that keeps coming up. And this is not mental health. We're just talking about understanding what that those associations are there and replacing them with a new path of least resistance. So the path of least resistance is some past, is not some past of little t. And here's what I have: bad experiences and I have good experiences. It could be that somebody achieved some level of success and they're so committed to only using that process, they shut the other ones out. So this becomes a major issue when you're going above the line, and this is why people get knocked back. This is why it's very difficult to achieve this. Very difficult to break through, but you can do it because it's just a process, not just a process, it's a process of unwinding those paths of least resistance and replacing them with new paths of least resistance. None of it's mystical mumbo jumbo. It's what neuroplasticity does. It's using the synaptogenesis through deep practice. You're myelinating new neurons as the new neurons are myelinated, and you're applying the system is providing additional neurotransmitter. You're able to layer in new paths, and make those paths least resistance using deep path of least resistance using deep practice. The other neural pathways are pruned. So the system is always looking at efficiency and it's adding new neurotransmitter, but it's also depleting those other neural pathways of neurotransmitter. And this is where you get plateaus. It's out of scope for today, but you can see as this working on efficiency, it's no longer making additional neurotransmitter. This is where you get plateaus. But there are things that you can do, and that's why we have this one, the allostatic capacity. Because when you use deep practice in the right way, the 7 factors: novelty, intention, precision, balance, progression, intensity, and struggle at the edge of ability. When you have all 7 of those factors, or at least 6 out of the 7, you're creating allostatic capacity where the system is creating more neurotransmitter than it needs. Neurotransmitter, the system is always predicting what's coming, and when the demands are more than it was expecting, you get more neurotransmitter, additional neurotransmitter. One, you have the dopamine, which is a signal amplifier as well as a habit formation. And then you have the serotonin, which is a feel good. But this is what enables the trajectory to be stabilized in an upward direction versus homeostasis, which is status quo. The last thing I'll mention is, although step 5, emotional modulation, and I say this is an optional step because you have the step 4, response. And before we go into taking action, we want to make sure that we're in a good place emotionally. Because of all the work that we do here in the first part of this, you'll see less and less and less need to do any emotional modulation. Just the act of changing your bias from threat to neutral is going to have a major impact on reducing the amount of times you feel like you're emotionally charged. But we can also do this as a habit. We can create the habit. It's a 90-second process, up to 90 seconds. It could be done in 2 seconds. So we could actually take this emotional modulation and do a light version of it inside here. That's another one of the things we can do. We have the reframing, the emotional modulation. We have the breathing, the anchors. That's another one, anchors. So if you do breathe meditation, you can take that to the next level and use that meditation and anchor. You can anchor yourself with the press of your hand, some kind of a mantra, something that you can say that brings you back to that alpha state. And when you get knocked off course, it's a reactivity thing. You can use that mantra or whatever it is that anchors you back there. For me, it's a breath. I just take in a deep breath and it anchors me back to my breathing sessions where I'm doing the 15-second inhales, 15-second exhales. And you just don't have those sensations. They just don't grow because they're interrupted. And that, hopefully, that helps start to pull things together with respect to behavioral goals or goals that require behavior change versus goals that require an identity change. And most of us can relate to that. And what I'm saying is that we can make the identity make the stretch and transformation goals more easily achieved because we're approaching the identity and reactivity not by trying to suppress it or change it from the construct, but by changing the elements that lead up to it. And because you're not changing every single hurt that a person has, you're just rewriting the knee-jerk effect. That's what you're rewriting. You're rewriting the knee-jerk effect. And by rewriting the knee-jerk effect, it's solving the problem across a plethora of past associations. There are going to be some that slip through, and that's why we do the 90 days, because you're unpeeling, like unpeeling the onion, because these are going to keep coming up. But again, it's a process. We get through it, and that's why I talk about using neuroplasticity. And I'll continue comparing it to other aspects of goal setting. For example, I'll talk the SMART, specific, measurable, aggressive, or attainable, depending on how you use the SMART, and then the relevant or realistic, again, depending on how you use it, and then time element, and how those apply, and the impact of those with respect to neuroplasticity. Again, what I'm doing is, let's put some language around neuroplasticity so we start to understand what it is. And I'm happy to answer any questions. We do have the ability for you to come on stage, and I typically will do this earlier in the process, but this link that I'm putting in the chat will get you into the stage, and then we can have a conversation. I can also see your comments in the chat. It does go to different platforms, and so I can't always tell if someone is out there or not, or how many people are out there, or what comments are coming in. But this way you can come on stage and we can have a conversation. It'll show up here that you want to come on stage. All right, I'm going to leave it there, and we'll be back on next week, Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific time. And I'll continue just talking about some actionable aspects with respect to neuroplasticity. We'll see you.